Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Atlantic's Anna Bross.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Bross, Senior Vice President of Communications for the Atlantic, and we want to welcome you to this year's Atlantic Festival. After 2 years of exclusively virtual programming, we are thrilled to bring the festival to life for an in-person audience here at our new home, The Wharf. Over the course of the next 75 minutes, we're going to talk about public safety and criminal justice reform. With the midterms approaching and these issues on the forefront of voters' minds, we will discuss the challenges and opportunities ahead for the criminal justice reform movement and how we can work together to find solutions that make our communities safer for all. Before we get started, we want to give a big thank you to the MacArthur Foundation for their support of the Atlantic Festival and for our journalism here at the Atlantic. Also, a few practical notes. Please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away. When posting on social, you can use the hashtag TAF22. We want you to be a part of the conversation. Now, let's get started.
For a discussion about reimagining justice and public safety, please welcome Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic Senior Editor Ron Brownstein.
Good morning, everybody. Wow, people in person. Something we haven't done in a while. Glad to be here. Mr. District Attorney, thank you so much for being here. You have been in the center of the storm really from day one since your election in 2017, and you certainly got one brewing now with the Republican-controlled General Assembly in Pennsylvania trying to impeach you, citing you for contempt, for rejecting an extensive document request they lodged as part of that effort. Tell us, in your view, why is this happening and where is it going?
It's happening because progressive prosecutors keep winning elections. There is a misperception that we're losing that's actually incorrect. We keep winning elections. They can't beat us in elections, so they try to remove us from office other ways, by recalls, by impeachments. In my situation, what occurred is for the first time in the history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the legislature is trying to remove an elected official for their policies. I repeat, policies. You can get removed for crimes or deeply corrupt activity. That's what impeachment is for. But you're not supposed to be removed because you and your policy won by a landslide and don't like it.
Can I ask you a threshold question? Can they remove, in your view, a local official as opposed to a statewide official?
No. In my view, the way Pennsylvania law is written, they can only remove statewide officials because there is a separate impeachment procedure for cities, and I happen to be in a city.
Mm-hmm. Well, the policy dispute is obviously about your approach and what is happening with crime in the city of Philadelphia. Through Monday, in the statistics from the police department, there have been 388 homicides in Philadelphia. That was the figure through Monday. That's double the number from that date as recently as 2015 through early September in 2015, and it's more than the full year total in any year from 2008 to 2018. We are still not back up to the levels of crime that we saw in the 1990s, but we are at an elevated rate from earlier in this century, not only in Philadelphia, but many other cities. What's happening? What's driving this?
Well, there's been an uptick really since 2014 in Philadelphia. That's more or less the low point nationally. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the things that are driving this, and some of the most thoughtful discussion about it comes from Jeff Asher, but the main thing driving it is guns. There are more and more and more guns every year we hang around, and if you look at the number of guns that are actually removed from the street by law enforcement, they are at least doubled or tripled by the new legal gun sales that are occurring. So we have seen an accumulation of guns in this country at this point where we have 1.5 guns per human being, more or less, and we have an NRA that would like to see a loaded gun tucked into every diaper. This is an NRA that would like us to be able to sell silencers, which it hasn't happened since the 1930s. They would like us to be able to print our guns at home on 3D printers. Absolutely the most damaging organization to public safety in the history of the United States.
Let me ask you about guns, because that is certainly one of the flashpoints in the debate about your approach in Philadelphia. It's also been a flashpoint in LA, where I live with George Gascon.
Right.
What to do with people who are caught with guns but haven't used them yet in a crime? Your view, as quoted recently in the New York Times, is that it's counterproductive to focus on arresting and incarcerating people caught carrying firearms without legal permit. Why do you think that?
So that view is not correct.
Okay.
It's counterproductive to prioritize that more than solving gun violence. The reality is that if you want to stop gun violence, you should pursue gun violence. That means you should solve homicides, you should solve shootings. The current solve rate, or at least the most recent measured solve rate for gun homicides in Philly is 28%. The most recent solve rate for shootings in Philly is 17%. Our conviction rate for homicides is approaching 90%, better than our predecessors, but we only get the cases they solve. So a lot of what has happened all across the country is you're seeing coming from FOP sources, right-wing sources, that the real problem is guns, it's not the homicides, and the reason they're saying that is they're having terrible difficulty solving the homicides. I do not say that, by the way, to besmirch the police. There are certain tools that they need. There are modern ways to actually solve these cases, including some absolutely unbelievable forensics that would blow your mind, but you got to invest in them. You can't just keep investing in zero accountability for police officers and investing in, basically compensation.
In fact, you had a landmark conviction of a police officer this week, yesterday, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I want to just be clear. Your view, what is your view about what should happen to people who are found with guns who have not yet committed a crime with that gun? Are you saying that they should, in fact, be prosecuted on a routine basis?
Yes, they should. Yes, we do. And the fact is that the House itself, before they decided to impeach me, did a study and found that the sentences for gun possession were longest in Philadelphia. Just so we understand what's really happening here, this is not coming from some real concern about crime. Our city is giving out longer sentences, including under my administration, which is now 5 years, for gun possession than any other category of cities in Pennsylvania, much of which is very Republican. So that's a total red herring. But here's the other side. If you look at people who have an arrest for a gun, and you look at the likelihood that they're actually going to use it to shoot, there's only, as we see it, a 1% correlation between got them with a gun and then they're going to get caught for a shooting. That's not to say it's not a serious issue. It just means you have to be careful. Before you take every single person who is frightened, because there's a lot of gun violence, and you take every single person who's basically law-abiding, but got brainwashed by the NRA that you don't need a permit to carry, because there are plenty of people who buy the gun legally, they buy it under their own name, they have no criminal intent, but they don't get the paperwork, and that's a crime. Before we do all of that, we should look carefully. Some of those people are really dangerous. They're members of groups that are driving gun violence. Others are truly law-abiding. And if you take a truly law-abiding person and you give them a felony and you make them unemployable and they cease to be providers and taxpayers, they cease to form families, they're separated from their families, you are increasing crime. Let me just give you an example. There's a very small group of cases where we divert. In other words, we take someone who's been arrested for gun possession, they got no record, they appear to be law-abiding people, and we put them through their paces. They're going to be doing stuff for a very long time that amounts to accountability. But at the end of it, they don't get convicted. That group's rate of recidivism is 1/6 of the rate of recidivism for people who are convicted for the same crimes. Conviction can do things that help public safety, but it can also do things that hurt public safety by breaking people's potential to go in a good direction.
You know, and you alluded to something that I have felt very much watching the fights over at Gascon and Boudin in California. The successes, in many ways, of progressive prosecuting strategies are invisible. When people are not incarcerated for a long time, when they're allowed to continue in their community, when they build families, when they go to work, they kind of vanish.
That's right.
But the people who take advantage of diversion and offend again become incredibly visible and become a symbol of the idea that these policies are too lenient and are seeding further crime. I mean, it's kind of a structural challenge. When you succeed, someone just becomes, they're in that long row of people getting on the subway every morning.
They're invisibly happy. But this is a problem that goes way back with criminal justice. If you're on probation and you're on parole, the only time we're going to see you is if you violate it. And then you come back into a courtroom. And as somebody who was in a courtroom before I had this job for a solid 30 years, 4 days a week, it's a system that always recognizes failure, but doesn't even have metrics for success. We don't even have metrics to say, okay, well, as opposed to committing a new crime, whatever that may be, are you now earning 6 figures? Have you cured cancer? Have you done amazing things for orphans? We don't see any of that stuff. And as a consequence, you get an extremely negative and one-sided view. But that's also how coverage in media can only look at what's visible It's also how you end up with a country that is simultaneously the most incarcerated country in the world and the most heavily armed country in the world. Compare us, for example, to modern Germany, where they have 1/9 the level of incarceration, and they have 1/9 the level of homicide. Isn't that kind of sort of what we want to be? And don't tell me Germany doesn't know how to be racist, and don't tell me Germany doesn't know how to be violent. They know how to be all of those things. But this is a country, just so we're clear, that has no death penalty, that considers every single person for parole at 15 years. I'm not saying they get it, but they consider them. They got it right. We're a disaster compared to that.
So let me ask you this. You, and I think many of the other progressive prosecutors, have talked about treating gun violence as a public health problem. In 2020, you created your Gun Crimes Strategies and Prevention Collaborative. You're in 2022, again, the statistics as of Monday, 1,700 shooting victims in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. What have you learned about the opportunities and limits of a public health strategy to combating gun violence? Do you feel like it's stemming the tide with those kinds of numbers?
I've learned we haven't tried it. This is a country that has not used public health to try to deal with addiction. We haven't. We have not used public health to deal with mental illness and homelessness. We haven't used public health to deal with criminal justice. What is happening here, unfortunately, is even though we do have reform going on in ways that are constructive, meaning the people who need to be in custody are in custody, and people who never needed to be in custody are coming out of custody, at least in places like Philadelphia and Los Angeles, all of the money that's being saved, which is an enormous amount of money, is not going back into rebuilding the mental health system that was torn down about 85% during the period of mass incarceration. All that money is not going into public schools, and in Philadelphia, public school kids are funded at half the level of the surrounding counties, because that's, don't get me into that topic, but that's another enormous problem. If we don't take the money that we're saving from doing stupid and put it into smart, then all we're doing is building another tax break for wealthy people. And there is going to be some level of failing to succeed as much as we could.
So give me your wish list. If you had a blank piece of paper and you were writing on it 5, 7, 9 policies to reduce those 1,700 shooting victims, what would be the things that you would do that the legislature could do, or the city council could do, or you could do?
Wow, it is deeply structural, but let me just mention a few. So on the enforcement side, the biggest thing that we should be doing is that we should be investing very, very heavily in modern forensics. You can do absolutely amazing things with cell phones that we could not do before. You can do amazing things right now with tiny bits of DNA, including tiny bits of DNA that are coming off gun evidence. You can do amazing things that would solve an enormous number of cases. And until we do that, the notion of deterrence is really not there.
Solving cases is the key.
Solving cases,
clearance rate is the key.
Solving cases is an enormous part of it. Obviously, we need to have reasonable gun regulation. We don't have it. Even if you stopped having any new guns in society, we would have this enormous boulder that we would have to move. But the notion that we don't have stronger gun regulation, frankly, is absurd.
What would be at the top of that list for the legislature in your mind? What would you like to see in Pennsylvania you don't have now? What tools on guns?
About 20. I mean, I don't want to bore you, but
no, but give us the highlights.
I don't know why we are allowing anybody to have an AR-15. I don't know why we're allowing people who are as young as are permitted to get them. I don't know why we have gun shows at all. I don't know why we have unregistered gun parts. I mean, the whole notion of a polymer gun or a ghost gun is that it's a loophole. You can get an unmarked piece of plastic and a bunch of unmarked pieces of metal that you can buy on the internet. You can put them together in your basement, and you can sell an arsenal around out the back door. And we see more and more ghost guns that are showing up at crime scenes, and it's doubling and tripling and quadrupling every year.
Are there community interventions to reduce violence that you feel are working? I mean, you're as you say, you're living in a period of a lot of shootings, a lot of homicides. Are there public health approaches that you think have succeeded or shown promise in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia? Or is the persistence of this a warning that those approaches may not be enough?
I think there are interventions, but I think they're the tip of the iceberg. So, for example, to have credible messengers who are intervening in conflicts and are doing so disconnected from law enforcement. In other words, they can get in between, P&B and Brickyard, two different groups that have been warring forever. When they know that there's a dispute, these are often people who were involved in that life earlier, came out of jail, and have some credibility to try try to tamp that down before it happens. That's an approach, a cure violence type approach that has worked in many areas around the country. But let's talk about the real problem. The real problem is what happened to public education. The real problem is what happened to our mental health system. What happened to treating addiction as opposed to incarcerating addiction? Mass incarceration itself, to the extent it put people in jail who did not have to be there, meant we had unparented children. Those are the people killing each other right now. That's who they are. And I'm not saying this in some theoretical way. I spent over a year going into jails and prisons talking to my clients back in the days when I was a criminal defense attorney. And that's just the reality. You talk to so many of these kids and so many of these people who are in jail for violence, so many of them have not been parented. They have not had support in public schools. They don't have adequate health care. If you really want to fix that, you have to provide for people's basic needs, and we don't do that.
Let me ask you about a number of the policies that have been flashpoints in cities around the country. Some of the prosecutors elected as part of this movement have opposed cash bail, sometimes in all cases. But you have taken a different approach, a more nuanced approach. You support high cash bail in cases of gun violence?
So I think we're actually all saying the same thing, but there's a general misunderstanding of what no cash bail is. No cash bail is what happens in D.C. No cash bail has happened in D.C. for over 30 years. There's only two stops on this train. One stop is you get out without having to pay money. You may have to go to a place that provides homeless services or mental health services or addiction services because whatever they're sending you to is associated with your interaction with police, and those are nonviolent offenses for the most part. But then there's the other group who sit in jail no matter how rich they are. You know, if you're Pablo Escobar, you got a couple dollars. What are we going to do? Say, here's $1 million bail. You're such a menace. It's $1 million bail. He'll pay it the next day. And that goes on all the time. So what happens in D.C. is about 12% of defendants are held until trial because they are considered that much of a danger. And about 88% are getting out because, for the most part, they're broke people who might end up in jail just because they don't have a job. So they can't pay a moderate bail. That's what we would like to do in Pennsylvania. That is what's going on to a large extent in New Jersey and now Illinois and Kentucky. It is something that has spread. But the problem in Pennsylvania is you got a legislature that likes its bail bonds people, makes a lot of money in donations off of their lobbyists, and they are in love with cash bail. What we did in Philly is we tried to simulate a no cash bail system by asking for very high bail, which is $1 million or more in some cases, and then no bail. We don't ask for these $10,000 bail, $15,000 bail amounts because they just make things worse.
How about treating juveniles as adults? What is your policies on that?
We actually think that the juvenile system, for the most part, and it's different in every state, but the juvenile system got it right, and the adult system should be more like the juvenile system. In other words, we're not just going to punish you, which is what the adult system does. We're going to actually try to look at the root cause and address it. That's the fundamental notion behind the juvenile system. Conservatives chipped away at that for a very long period of time. They went without question in the wrong direction. The modern trend is to try to have fewer juveniles in these placements, many of which, and I'm not making this up, cost $250,000 a year, where they get inadequate educations. They're often abused in different ways. They come out, and we find them getting arrested soon thereafter. The modern trend is to try to move them closer to home, closer to community. That is not to say that a juvenile who is 17 and is involved in a homicide in Pennsylvania should be in juvenile court because our jurisdiction ends at 21. That gives me only 4 years to deal with that situation. So we do prosecute some of the most serious cases in adult court, but we don't do it in this, how shall I put it, this sort of mandatory sentencing, lockstep, rigid, non-discretionary approach, which is what my predecessors did, and that is what most traditional prosecutors do.
In the other direction, rigid, lockstep, I feel that some of the prosecutors elected as part of this movement have tried to set absolute rules, no juveniles as adults, no sentencing enhancements, no cash bail, in large part because they believe if you give any leeway, the career prosecutors will simply ignore their direction, and that has kind of that absolutism has kind of taken them to unfortunate extremes in the other direction, hard cases where an absolute rule is politically vulnerable. Do you feel as though at this point your office is rowing in the same direction?
No, not at all. I mean, we have actually been extremely careful in essentially every single written policy we have, and if they're not already up now, every one of our policies will be available on our website to the entire world, should you be bored and have nothing to do. We have always said in these policies that individual justice is required, that there may be individual situations where it should not apply. If you don't think it should, go to your supervisor. If your supervisor, if you still think your supervisor is wrong, go to me. I mean, that's been the policy for a long time. Individual justice means you just are humble enough to admit that we can't predict every single possible scenario in the future. So even though we think this is the right general approach, come to us if there's a situation where you don't think it's proper. And that works both ways. If the policy you think is too generous to the defendant and you don't like that, come to us. If you think it's too rigid and too hostile to the defendant, come to us and let's see where we are.
Finally, you won a landmark conviction yesterday of a police officer for on-duty shooting, a manslaughter conviction. The first one, I believe, in at least 50 years, the Philadelphia Inquirer says, in the city. The first jury trial for a Philadelphia police officer for on-duty behavior in at least 40 years. You have several more in the pipeline. What is the message you are sending with these cases?
Well, I mean, the message is what it always should have been, which is that justice applies to everybody. We've probably cleared 150 or 200 shootings toward or of civilians by police in uniform. But we have charged 3 officers with homicide so far. And, I mean, to me, this is not complicated. If you commit a murder, if you shoot an unarmed person in the back and you don't have a lawful justification, the fact that you're in uniform doesn't excuse that. I am under some limitations on what I can say about these cases because they're either pending or we're pre-sentencing right now. But honestly, I know the Inquirer reported 50 years. I think it might be 50,000 years. I think it might. I think it might be that the city of Philadelphia has never, ever, ever, ever held a police officer accountable for a homicide at that level. And this is part of the reason why I can't get witnesses in homicide cases, because a lot of those witnesses do not trust the police. This is part of the reason I can't get victims to come forward sometimes in shooting cases. Only part of the reason. Because there's such a broken relationship between police, who are viewed as, unfortunately, in some instances being unaccountable. Now, I have to say this, though. I hope you don't mind I'm interrupting you.
No, please.
But there's a lot of really great cops in Philly. They just have a rotten leadership of their union. But there are a lot of really good cops in Philadelphia who are trying to do it the right way. And every time we knock down a corrupt police officer or a vicious, brutal police officer, we're just lifting up the good ones, which also hasn't been done in forever.
So President Biden says nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
You do?
Yep.
Final question. I know we're running out of time. There's a sense that this movement is on the defensive now, as you noted, with the recall of Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, the attempted recall of Gascon, the fight that you're facing in Pennsylvania. Is it possible to maintain support for alternative approaches that focus less on incarceration while crime is going up, or is getting this under control, the crime rate stable or declining, the key to long-term success for this movement?
Well, first I would say the way to get it under control is criminal justice reform, because doing things in a just way actually does make us safer. And I know that sounds like a platitude, but let me just give you an example of why I think they're really at our throats. So 10 years ago, there were essentially 0 progressive prosecutors, and no portion of the U.S. population lived in a jurisdiction with a progressive prosecutor. 2.5 years ago, 10% of the U.S. population. Right now, it's about 20%. It's about 20%. 75 million Americans have elected or re-elected a progressive prosecutor. They all want to talk all day about Chesa Boudin and his recall. All day, they want to talk about that. Who here knows that we have a new district attorney in Memphis who is a progressive and replaced a very conservative incumbent? Who here knows that in Alameda County, right across from San Francisco, Pamela Price is about to win, and win big, and she lost 4 years ago? It is not the case that progressive prosecution is dead. It actually, the real case here is that even in this incredibly difficult time, it's maintaining. I wouldn't say it's growing, doubling in leaps and bounds like it did around the events surrounding George Floyd, but it is maintaining. And it is and understand also, 20% of the population, that's probably 30% of all criminal cases in the United States, because these are big jurisdictions like Chicago and New York. So the reality is we're doing really well, and they can't beat us in elections. And they're worried about that for one primary reason, since the truth is conservatives don't actually care very much about crime. They really don't. What they're really worried about is that criminal justice reform is something that connects to voters who are unlikely voters, who are alienated from the system, who finally are seeing some reason to go to the polls, which is why we had insane turnouts in our off-year, low-turnout elections both times I ran, and we've seen this in many other jurisdictions. If I am a MAGA Republican, the last thing I want to see is any progressive prosecutor still standing, because what it could be is the salvation of democracy, and they are out to destroy democracy.
We'll leave that as the last word. Mr. Krasner, thank you for joining us.
Now, for a discussion about data and trends in crime, please welcome Ames Grawert, Senior Counsel in the Brennan Center for Justice's Justice Program, and Anna Harvey, the Director of New York University's Public Safety Lab. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Caitlin Dickerson.
Hello. Thank you to Anna and Ames for joining me, to our audience in person and everyone online. As you all know, we're here to talk about crime, the frequency of crime. It's changed a lot in the last couple of years, but it's also difficult to understand. It's happening in cities, which we often hear about, but it's also happening in suburbs. It's even happening in rural areas. It's not all types of crime. So we're going to dig into the complexity of the data, but hopefully also go beyond that. So you walk away knowing more than just it's complicated, but what's working and what isn't, and how we found ourselves here. So Ames, can you start? You've done some really good work breaking down, what does it mean that crime is increasing? When we say that, where is it increasing? Who is it impacting? What types of crime are we talking about?
Absolutely, happy to speak to that. So to understand how we got to where we are today, on this beautiful day in September 2022, we sort of have to rewind back to 2020. So that year we saw a very significant increase in murders, roughly 30% increase in the national murder rate, which, just to put it simply, is it's not really have a lot of historical precedent. We also saw the assault rate, or the rate of serious violent offenses, go up by around 10%. At the same time, a sort of interesting sort of split trend with property crime offenses trending downward. But that is all blotted out, of course, by the huge increase in violent offenses. So we know a few things about what that looked like around the country, because as you alluded to, that sort of national picture can mask some real variation. So I'm going to touch on sort of three big things we know. One is that the increase in homicides was diffuse. It happened in so-called red cities, it happened in blue cities, it happened in red states, it happened in blue states, it happened in counties helmed by progressive prosecutors, it happened in counties not helmed by progressive prosecutors. If you're looking to cram this data into a convenient political narrative, it just doesn't really fit, no matter which way you cut it. And Professor Harvey can talk about some of that as well. Her research is right on point. That's one thing we know. Another thing we know, somewhat contradictorily, is that the increase in violence was quite concentrated. If you look at New York City, where the Brennan Center is based, the communities where homicide increased most significantly, you plot them on a map, as the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice has done. You'll see those are the same communities that have dealt with decades of economic hardship, abandonment by government officials, segregation, and high base rates of violence. These are neighborhoods, these are blocks where the great crime decline that we talk about so much, the precipitous drop in violence from 1990 to 2014, it happened, but not the same way it happened in like Brownstein, Brooklyn. So that's number two. And number three, we know that this experience was varied by sort of what you were doing in 2020. So there seems to be a sort of tension between, we have data showing that, thank you very much. No worries. We have data showing that crime rates, even though they increased in 2020, are still relatively low in historical terms. And we have anecdata from people living their lives saying that their experience of violence, their experience of crime changed dramatically during 2020. There's actually some great research by Aaron Chafflin, who's, I think, helped square the circle on this. What he points out is that even if violent crime did not increase as much as it may feel like for some people, for people who are actually out on the streets in 2020 as essential workers, on the subway, et cetera, their exposure to violence, like the rate at which they would experience violence, was significantly elevated. So these are a couple things we know about crime and violent crime. I'm going to talk very quickly about what we know about more recent information. We had a great panel conversation before this one about misinformation and democracy. And since I'm speaking to a room where there's a non-trivial amount of journalists, I'm just going to give you a heads up on something that might be an important dynamic on misinformation. The gold standard for understanding crime in the United States at the national level is a data set aggregated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and published annually. Ordinarily, we'd be expecting data on national crime trends from 2021 on Monday. But because of the, which is a 9-month lag time between the end of the year and when we get crime data, that's unacceptable in the world's most advanced democracy, but that's another issue. Because of a way the FBI is changing how they aggregate crime data and how they report it, a change that will make the system better in the long run. We're not going to have great data about crime in 2021, and if you ask me to put a bet on it, I bet we're not going to get anything on Monday. So we're going to be flying without the benefit of national crime trends for a good deal of time. What we do know is that it looks like murder rates at least increased at a much slower rate in 2021. If you look at a panel of cities, for example, as the Council on Criminal Justice, a great organization, has done. And if you look at select cities, it looks like murder rates started to bend down in 2022. So murder is down year to date in New York City, for example. When you look at murder trends, it may be that we're stabilizing and going down, but it's really hard to tell until we get that FBI information. It's a complex picture.
Okay, so it's a complex picture. It sounds like you're saying if you live in a community that was already dealing with higher crime relative to others and government mismanagement or abandonment, as you said, you felt it more depending on what type of job you have or where you live. You may have felt it more, and also the data is not good. Despite that, though, I know you two know a lot. So, Anna, as a layman, I think about the pandemic. We've just come out of, we're coming out of, it depends who you talk to. If you're talking to the president, this pandemic, and everyone remembers now what he said. So I'm thinking about, the economic consequences of the pandemic, the social consequences of the pandemic. How is the pandemic impacting? Is the pandemic the reason or a big reason behind the changes we're seeing?
Certainly a big reason. And so Ames just said, the big increase in homicides and violent crime, that happened in 2020, the first year of the pandemic onset. And I think in order to understand that, it's important to understand what we know from the research evidence about what the drivers of criminal activity are and what interventions work to reduce crime, violent crime in particular. And I think about those drivers and those investments as investing in people, in places, and in reducing increasing the probability of detection, because criminal activities, there's a lot of it that's opportunistic. So investments in people, things like, things that where we invest in our kids, and that means things like after-school programs, summer jobs programs, lengthening the school day, providing safe and structured places for kids and adolescents to go has this really, these really nice series of randomized controlled trials has big reductions in crime.
Things that didn't exist during the pandemic.
Things that closed down and absolutely didn't exist during the pandemic. Things like substance abuse treatment programs. So substance abuse is a major driver of criminal activity, and those programs are an important support for people. And even though we provided financial assistance to people during the pandemic, a lot of those social service programs, including things like substance abuse treatment, shut down just because everything was on lockdown. And things like providing short-term emergency financial assistance. So we provided the checks, but things like providing emergency housing assistance are really important too. And again, that was a program that largely got shut down. So investments in people, those programs were stalled or didn't exist during the pandemic. Another thing that works to reduce crime is investment in places. So, we talk a lot about things like improving lighting, greening, vacant lots to improve sight lines, making lots into parks so that people get out on the streets. This is very Jane Jacobs, but it works to get more eyes on the street because you're increasing the probability that somebody will see somebody engaging in criminal activity and report it. And so crime goes down when you can get people out. And people, were in their homes, right, during 2020. There were many, many fewer people out on the street. So that happened. And then the third thing is, the probability of detection more generally. And we rely on our police departments for that. So that means visible police patrols, deterrent patrols in high crime neighborhoods. It means when somebody makes a 911 call, a call for service, getting there quickly. The best practice is within 5 to 7 minutes. And then when you get there, taking them seriously and taking the time to listen to them, to interview them, to collect evidence, to stay on the case until you've identified a perpetrator, so you're increasing clearance rates. I mean, on the previous panel, Larry talked about the good cops in Philadelphia, and that's what good cops do, right? They take crime victims seriously, they get there, they work to resolve those cases. One thing that happened during the pandemic is that lots of police officers got sick. In many places, officers resisted getting vaccinated, right? So even after we had vaccines, lots of officers were still calling out sick. In New York City, we had the NYPD, the force was down by at least 20% at times. Wow. And call response times went up in New Orleans, which currently has the highest per capita homicide rate in the country. If you call a 911 emergency in New Orleans right now, the average response time is 30 minutes. It takes half an hour for the police to get there, and by then it's just demonstrably too late. You make a non-emergency 911 call, it's over 2 hours. So police forces are down in part because of sickness, in part because of resignations, and those forcing and staff reductions have really impacted the ability of the police to respond effectively to crime.
What about, Anna, the psychological effects of the pandemic? And does that have a link to gun sales, which I've seen academics, journalists talking about a connection there between violent crime, gun sales, mental health, psychology? What's the connection? Gun
sales absolutely went up during the pandemic, and the crime that went up the most sharply during the pandemic was shooting-related crimes. So non-fatal shootings and the homicides were disproportionately shooting cases. So that is absolutely true. And we, as we all know, do not do a great job in this country of regulating, controlling guns, the flow of guns, the traffic of guns. I think what I want to say about that, though, is that's probably, to me, it feels more, we're in this larger context of essentially an unregulated gun environment. But then there was this stressor, as you say, the psychological stressor of the pandemic, where all of these other supports that people normally had in communities were just evaporated almost overnight. March 16th, 2020, and that was a shock to communities that they're still not recovering from.
You hear a lot about bail reform in coverage of shifting crime trends. Ames, what does this have to do with bail reform, if anything?
Yeah, it's a great and important question. I think something that's interesting when you study, as I do, crime trends and policy changes, you wind up with a lot of sort of accidents of history. And one of the unfortunate accidents of history when we look at crime trends since 2020 is bail reform in New York State, one of the most closely watched states in the union and one of the more populous states in the union, goes into effect January 1, 2020. The pandemic, of course, happens 3 months later, and crime trends begin to spike upwards around that time. So many people, some of whom I don't think are acting in good faith, and I'd love to talk about that, of course, have drawn a direct link between bail reform and rising crime rates. I just want to say one thing at the top, that if I could leave you all with just one thing on this panel, if someone tries to tell you that there's one factor that explains the 2020 crime increase, they're trying to sell you something. So figure out what it is. The argument that bail reform is that one factor has never really held water. There's some really good coverage by the New York Post sort of early into the pandemic showing that, in fact, police claims by the NYPD that bail reform was driving shootings actually didn't align with their own internal data. That was an interesting story. The best available research we've had since then, using data that's published by the state, shows that the rates at which people who are released because of bail reform go on to be rearrested for a violent offense are quite low, sub 5%. I don't think we can conclusively claim what the effects of bail reform are with just 2 years implementation data, but that's not what I'd expect to see if bail reform were the driver or a significant driver of crime and violent crime in New York City and New York State, for example. And then just to wrap up on one more point, and I think this is such an important one to consider when we look at crime trends in 2020. States with bail reform, states without bail reform, cities, rural areas, suburbs, all types of communities saw crime increase in 2020. If you're going to look for explanations, you shouldn't be zeroing in as like the single cause on a state policy enacted in one jurisdiction. You should be looking at some broader trends like the one that Anna was talking about. Unfortunately, I think this is a debate that we're going to be having for years to come, and we're going to do our best to contribute to some of the research on that at the Brennan Center.
Dispel some of that misinformation. Relatedly, I want to know, Anna, how are police responding to the shifting trends that we're talking about here? What's working, what isn't working, and then what are the downstream consequences of effective policing, but that then carries on in people's lives in terms of economic impacts and the like?
Yeah, well, so, police departments, and I've worked with departments, and I'm open to doing more work with departments, but they're pretty insular, closed off places, right? So Larry mentioned the role of police unions. So there are things that we know that work in terms of policing, right? And the two most important things that work, if we want to have effective police forces, is one, to actually, respond to calls when people call asking for help and get there quickly and then do your job. And then second is to be a benevolent, patrolling, deterrent presence in high crime neighborhoods. We know that just having the visible police presence does deter violent crime in particular. But police departments have traditionally measured their own performance in terms of things like arrests. So how many arrests are we making? How many stops are we making? So these are things they can count, and importantly, it is easy for them to drive up arrests and stop rates with the low-hanging fruit. So you and I are both in New York. Mm-hmm. So if you kind of, stand behind the Metro Fare card vending machine, and you watch people go through the turnstiles, you're going to find kids and people trying to get to their jobs who are jumping the turnstile. It's really easy. So one officer told me, he said it's called policing from the bush. It's like if you're in your car, right? And it's like you're driving, the cop car is hiding behind the tree or the bush. That's pretty easy, right? So you can get a lot of arrests that way. Those arrests, and this is really important to know, those low-level nonviolent misdemeanor arrests and the stops for no good reason have no relationship to violent crime trends. So it's a waste of our taxpayer money. It's a waste of police resources, but also even worse, if those individuals are then prosecuted. So they then enter the criminal justice system. In almost every jurisdiction, they acquire criminal records, statewide criminal records of charges. Even if those charges are later dismissed by a benevolent prosecutor's district attorney's office, they still have criminal records of charges that will impact their employment prospects going forward. It's damaging, and in some work that I've done in Suffolk County, which includes Boston, it changes individuals' behavior. Once you acquire that first line on your criminal record, it's kind of like, okay, well, it's game over, right? So it's incredibly damaging to do that. So we need to have mayors and police chiefs listen to us when we say, we don't want you to use as a metric just the stops and arrests. We want you to use, is crime actually going down, and are you actually taking, civilians seriously when they call you for help? So that's a cultural change that needs to happen.
So a really important distinction that you just drew, and I want to emphasize, between what works, which is benevolent patrolling and a presence, and that is not stop and frisk. That is not prosecuting or going after and pressing charges for low-level crimes, which in fact has no connection. You said there's a lot of evidence behind with violent crime. So I want to talk about public opinion and wrap up there in our last minute, which is connected to what we were just discussing, and what might seem like it works, what doesn't, what people see on the street, how it influences their perceptions of crime, and how that then influences what we do about it in cities, at the state level, federally. Ames, can you wrap us up in the last 45 seconds and talk about the disparity that often exists between public opinion and what you do, which is study the data? And what does that mean? How does that impact our ability to actually make progress?
Definitely. I just want to highlight just a note of strong agreement with what Anna said about the impact of criminal records. Brennan Center research really suggests there's no such thing as a lower level criminal record. Yeah. Our findings done by a paper with my colleague, Professor Terrian Craigie at Smith College, finds that misdemeanor records are associated with a 16% reduction in annual earnings. That's the difference between making do and not making do. Prison records are associated with a 50% reduction in annual earnings, $500,000 over the course of a lifetime, which is shocking. But to close out on that point with a hopeful note, I think the challenge of public opinion here is people are worried, people are scared, people are concerned about their safety, and they're right to be. Like those feelings are valid, especially when you look at a 30% increase in the murder rate. The challenge is to navigate between panic and urgency. We need policymakers to appreciate the urgency of the matter without giving way to panic and a sort of reaction of falling back into policies that we know don't work. Mm-hmm. Instead, we need creative solutions, which I know we're going to hear about very soon as well.
Thank you both so much. I've learned a lot.
And now, for a conversation produced by our underwriter, please welcome Cook County Public Defender Sharon Mitchell Jr. and John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Senior Program Officer Brea Gillum.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much to the Atlantic Festival for organizing what I hope you guys are enjoying. Has been some great conversations and discussions. As you heard, I'm Brea Gillum. I work at the MacArthur Foundation, and our criminal justice initiative is called the Safety and Justice Challenge, which is focusing on the way that America thinks about and uses jails. And we're doing that by investing in local communities, investing in local partners to really address and understand the reasons why our jail populations are increasing, why we're using jails for people who are experiencing homelessness, behavioral health, substance use, or simply can't afford bail. And we're also looking to address the racial injustices that are happening throughout the criminal justice system. I'm excited to be joined today by one of our partners in our work, Sharon Mitchell, who I just learned has been in Cook County for almost essentially your entire life, where I have just left Washington, D.C. So I think it would be great for the audience just to learn more about your journey to becoming the public defender and how you became so invested in criminal justice reform.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. As you said, I'm a lifelong Chicagoan. I'm pretty born. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I think growing up in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, I think you learn very quickly that that kind of basic story that the criminal legal system is just bad guys chasing good guys isn't true. And you learn about the harms the criminal legal system can provide to communities. So I think early on, I was interested in criminal justice and interested in representing folks that I thought were getting a bad shake. So was blessed enough to get through high school and college and law school and started as a Cook County Public Defender. Did that work for a good bit of time. Thought that it was important for me to take my experience to the policy space. So I joined a policy organization, fought for a lot of really interesting things, including the end of cash bond, which is going to happen in Illinois at the beginning of the year, and then returned back to the Cook County Public Defender's Office to lead the office, and I was appointed about 15 months ago. So here we are.
Well, we just had Larry Krasner sort of talk about the role of the progressive prosecutor. So I think it's so great that we're having this balanced conversation and you here representing the public defender side. I think it'd be helpful to sort of understand what is your role in helping to transform the justice system and what is your approach to addressing the racial and ethnic disparities that we see also in the system?
Yeah, now first off, I'm not bitter at all that Larry Krasner got a little bit more time than me. We're used to it as public defenders. We're used to it, it's okay. But listen, public defenders have a very unique role in the criminal legal system. I think we have a monopoly on, very interesting data that may be very different than what you normally see is collected. Most data collected, as we talked about in the last panel, is about arrests and convictions and things of that nature. Things like, how much money is being pulled out of communities because of cash bond. That's something that really doesn't get counted. Public defenders have that perspective. We're talking to clients. We have relationships with clients. And quite frankly, for the vast majority of time, criminal laws, what's collected, what data is collected, that issue has been controlled by prosecutors and police. Those are the folks that have written the laws that are governed by, and public defenders have been shut out. I think in Illinois, we actually have an opportunity, what we've seen with the movement toward ending cash bail is that advocacy community are partnering with the kind of the progressive legal community. They've brought in public defenders, and I think we are moving toward a much more fair system. But I just think that we have a monopoly on good ideas, we have a monopoly on perspectives and data, and it just hasn't been untapped. It's been untapped.
Yeah. So you touched on a little bit, Illinois is in the process of ending cash bail through this new law that's going into effect early next year, the Illinois Pretrial Fairness Act. There's been a lot of misinformation about what exactly is this legislation. So can you explain sort of briefly kind of what exactly does it do and how it does more than just end cash bail?
Yeah, so, Illinois is in the middle of a kind of an election cycle, election season. We have a gubernatorial race coming up, and there are certainly groups of people that believe that the issue of crime is like their foray into power and more seats. So you've seen a pretty well-funded, well-organized, well-resourced campaign to tell lies about this justice reform that got passed in the wake of the Taylor and Floyd uprisings. So they've called it the Purge Law. They've called it everything but the Son of God. But in the end, what it does, it basically says that money shouldn't be a determining factor in whether somebody should be in jail or not, and that the system has done a really poor job of making those decisions. So we see thousands and thousands of black people, brown people, people really of all colors stuck in jail, not because the judge is saying that they're risky, but because they don't have the money. And on the other side, the prosecutors sometimes say, well, listen, this person was able to bond out and maybe that person shouldn't have been able to. So this is a system that I think will reduce inappropriate pretrial incarceration, but it also will allow the system to make better decisions, because that's a really important decision. People who are in jail before trial are far more likely to plead guilty and far more likely to serve a longer prison sentence. So it's really important that we get that decision right, and we've done a really poor job in the status quo, and I think the Pretrial Fairness Act is a really good step forward.
I know a lot of us are excited to sort of see that work ahead. It's going to be some tough work, but...
Yeah, it's really tough work. When a person goes before a judge after a person is arrested, it's really difficult to kind of predict what's going to happen with that person. But the reality of the situation is that the current system has basically thrown their hands up and just said, we're going to throw out a random number and see what happens. The decision is really too important to do that. And I think that this is a really balanced approach. There will always be changes to the law. And I was kind of listening to the legislative session last year, and we're still passing laws about the sale of alcohol. Prohibition was how long ago, and we're still passing laws. So it's not unusual for us to be tweaking things. But I really do think that this is an incredibly important first step.
Listen, I sort of want to ask sort of on this last question I have is, this work is hard. You and I have been invested in it for a number of years, you definitely more than me. Sort of what keeps you hopeful? How do you sort of remain optimistic about change, sort of working in the trenches night and day on this stuff? Where do you see some of the bright spots?
I mean, we have no choice but to work in it, right? We've got 400 attorneys in Cook County that I'm helping to lead, a couple hundred investigators and support staff. In an average year, an average non-COVID year, we do over 100,000 cases. 70,000 cases this year. We have no choice but to fight, right? I'm a son of the South Side. I've got people in my family that have been both victims of violence, but also victims of traditional violence, but also victims of incarcerative violence. People whose lives have been taken away by a legal system that isn't fair. So for me, I have no choice but to fight because the legal system is going to exist. How fair it will be, sometimes it's up to public defenders, advocates that are willing to fight for people's rights. And I'm just here to do that.
I love that. Well, everybody, please join me in thanking Sharon for this wonderful conversation.
Here to discuss public safety and violence reduction, please welcome Eddie Bocanegra, the Justice Department's Senior Advisor on Community Violence Intervention, and Linda Harllee Harper, the Director of Gun Violence Prevention for the District of Columbia. Back to lead the conversation is The Atlantic's Ron Brownstein.
Senior Advisor for Community Violence Intervention in the Office of the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs, because it gets to kind of the heart of what I'd like to start by asking you. We're talking about community interventions. You're in that big building down the road. What is the role of the federal government in promoting bottom-up solutions, and who do you work with? Do you work with the groups themselves? Do you work with local governments? Where does the federal government plug into a bottom-up effort like that?
Yeah, it's funny. Just a few months ago, I was in a nonprofit work at Heart and Alliance in Chicago, And fundamentally, one of the questions that I would always ask, like, where does the federal government fit in all this? All these billions of dollars, resources, how do we tap into this? And here I am, right? First person in this position, given this is a new initiative from the administration, the Biden administration, but also the Department of Justice. And I would just simply say that the Office of Justice Program is the arm of our giving to community. And there are several programs under that particular umbrella. Some which you might be aware of, which is the BGA, NIJs, are all acronyms, which I'll maybe get to in a second. But the point here is this, is that our efforts right now, we have about $100 billion that pretty soon we'll be rolling out. $100 million specifically to CVI. Yeah, with an M.
Yeah.
Million.
Million, all right.
Which in reality is not nearly enough for the work that we're trying to do here. But to answer your question, that these resources are going to go to local municipalities. They're either going to go to the city, they're going to go to nonprofits, they're going to go to larger coalitions, small organizations, large organizations, to really start building the infrastructure that for too many years our communities have been disinvested in.
What's the animating principle? Like, what are you trying to seed specifically? What do you want to see more of when you put this money out there?
Well, we want to make sure that there is a complementary approach to public safety. When you think about the investments that we give into law enforcement and the investments that we give into nonprofits and alike, this extremely disproportionately misaligned here. And so the goal for us is like, how do we begin to build the infrastructure for many of the cities who are grappling with this issue of gun violence to start building the pathways to sustain their work long term with the hope of reducing gun violence? Well,
let's talk about it from the other end, on the ground. Here in DC, like many cities, gun violence remains, a serious challenge. We're just talking about Philadelphia, 1,700 shootings as of September. What programs have you seen that are promising? Where do you see opportunities to break the cycles?
No, I appreciate the question because, we talk a lot about the data, and it's tough to talk about the data when you have a shooting that happens yesterday or, recently that involves multiple people. It's hard to have the conversation about whether or not gun violence is going up or down. It's about how the community feels, right? And so, as they said in the prior panel, people are feeling unsafe. And so I think that for us, what we are realizing here in the district is that we want to put our mayor has really done an excellent job at balancing out law enforcement and non-law enforcement approaches. And so my focus is really on having a liaison with law enforcement, which we do, and my law enforcement liaison's here with me, but also we have community-based programs with violence intervention experts and credible messengers and roving leaders. We have all kinds of different titles for them, but they all fall under the umbrella of community violence intervention. And they're all folks who are from the community with similar lived experiences, who are experts on the culture of their communities and who understand the gun violence and understand what's going on and who are playing an integral role in interrupting
What does
violence.
community violence intervention translate into in that sense? What are these individuals doing?
Good, great question. So, and I think it's important that people have to understand what it looks like, what it is, because we're using it a lot, and we're very fortunate that under this president, we're starting to talk about it on a national level about community violence intervention. But it means that persons who are from the community, who have sometimes have been involved in criminal activity in their past, who have an understanding about the persons who are in the community, who may have relationships with their families, who may have long tentacles in the community, who know, I might know your father, or I may know your grandmother, or who have relationships in the community, are able to be the ones who are the credible messengers, literally, the persons who can go and speak to those who are at risk of gun violence as perpetrators or as victims, engage them, and our goal is non-law enforcement approaches to help to meet their needs, to have a transformation in their lives, and to give them hope, which is what we are realizing, that a lot of the persons that we are interacting with, they don't have hope. And so if you don't think that you're going to live beyond the next 5 years, whatever the sentence is that you try to dangle in front, it doesn't matter. If I think I'm not going to live for the next 5 years, it doesn't matter if you say I'm going to increase the sentence for carjacking from this to this. It doesn't even register in that way.
The mayor in April announced kind of an interesting focus where she said trying to identify the literal universe of people who are most likely to commit a crime with a gun. So there were 200. It was like 200 actual people that you could point to and intervene with. She said, we know that a relatively small number of people are responsible for a significant amount of the gun violence. What we are doing is reaching out to those people, listening to them, and figuring out what they need, and then working with them to get them on a better, safer path forward. What are you learning about what it takes to do that? And I want to bring you in on that question.
Yeah,
as well.
So we call them people of promise. And it's a problem analysis was done in the district by the National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform, where they actually worked with MPD, went through all of the cases from the past and really looked at who was the most high risk at being involved in gun violence and based on past behaviors and based on a lot of things, interviews with detectives for the crimes, and came up with this list. And so what we're seeing is that there's some persons who are really ready to make a transition and a transformation in their lives but didn't quite know how to go about it. And oftentimes having a credible messenger in your life who can help you to see that, no, actually the services that the city has for you are actually for you. You know, there's a lot of mistrust between the public and the government sometimes, particularly this population we're talking about. They have real needs, housing needs, employment needs, food, basic needs that need to be met, that oftentimes we can help build a bridge by meeting some of those needs, but also directing you to an employment training program that's actually going to pay you while you're getting trained so that you can actually see yourself in the future in having a career that actually is going to pay you money. We have a very successful CDL program that is working really closely to get folks trained with commercial driver's licenses and helping them to pass the exam. And it's a shortage across the country. It creates an opportunity.
Eddie, you came out of this community-based work in Chicago before you were in your current position. Can you talk a little bit about what that program was and how it is shaping, if at all, the way you are thinking about attacking these problems now from the federal level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to bridge your first question and this question just asked and build on what Linda just shared. So imagine if we lived in a society where we use our resources for those who actually are really in need of these services. And when you think about gun violence across the country, and I think about even Chicago, where gun violence is very concentrated in certain pockets in the cities, very similar to Baltimore, very similar to most key cities here in the U.S. About 70 to 80% of the homicides typically reside within specific communities. So we know what communities are being impacted, and we could talk about this structural racism that exists there, the infrastructure, all those different things. They're all things that we need to be thinking about to build that out. But the second thing behind that is that if we had the resources, and while they're limited, if we're able to identify those who are at the highest risk of gun involvement, either victimization or perpetration, and imagine saturate them with those resources, right? Too often what we do is we identify these individuals and we try to send them into prison. The problem is that all we're doing is we're taking one problem and putting it somewhere else, and we're not really addressing the root causes of those issues. I will tell you that when I was in Greater Chicago, our EADI, it is the only program, the only intervention in this country that has a randomized controlled trial study, and it is that kind of study that really further allows us to make the example and the argument that this population is really worth investing in. And I'll just share a couple of things.
Yeah, talk about it, how it works, yeah.
So for example, building on what Linda just shared, you know, the idea is that when you intervene and disrupt a conflict between, you know, two individuals or sometimes, you know, groups of individuals, it's difficult for having an office worker just simply to tell, put your gun down, because the next day, the likelihood of that happening is still going to occur. So we have to be very thoughtful that these individuals can't see beyond the 5 years. They can't even see beyond tomorrow. Most of the time we see data tells us that most of the time they're unstable housing, they're unemployed. Education, for example, when I think about Ready, 80% of the men in Ready, Chicago had only a 10th grade level of education, but they were reading at a 5th and 6th grade level. So how do they fit into the economy when they can't even read or write? So that's just fundamentally just like some basics right there. The other thing that I would say at Ready, 17 to 18, on average they have 17 to 18 arrests, right? So we know that there's involvement with the criminal justice system already to begin with. So that's an opportunity to engage them in pro-social behaviors. The last thing that I would say is that providing employment is one thing. Allowing them to sustain and get the training that they need is another thing, particularly with individuals who have chronic exposure to violence, to trauma. And really what that also means that the interventions have to have a holistic approach. They have to think about the mental health, the family engagement, how to navigate the court systems, and so on. I can go on and on. But I would say those lessons that we learned through Ready Chicago is exactly what's helping to inform our strategy here at the Department of Justice. along with other promising innovation programs that we're seeing this. Too often this field of CBI continue to look at these two models from the 1990s. We also need to evolve. And that also means when I look at colleagues at MacArthur and other foundations who have been putting some stake in the game by really investing in innovation, that allows the federal government, particularly OJP right now, to take some of those resources to also think about what are some promising solutions to build the evidence, right? So that we could have a stronger argument when we're thinking about policies.
Can I ask you about one thing that Larry Krasner said when we were talking that surprised me? He emphasized the importance of clearing cases, the law enforcement side of it, the fact that so many incidents of gun violence do not result in a conviction. And I've heard others argue that essentially encourages people to, they think they're dealing out justice themselves on the streets with more violence. What is the role of law enforcement, if at all, in breaking this cycle? Does it matter how many people are convicted once they actually pull the trigger? Linda?
I think it matters, but I also think that it matters, you know, we, here in DC, we're really working on changing the culture and improving the relationship between the city and the police department. And when the police department is the city, but just improving that relationship. And our police department really is trained and really talks a lot about the needs of the people that they encounter. I think that we are really have grown in a lot of ways in having police to reach out and say, hey, this guy needs some help. If you all don't get him, we're going to get him. He's going down the wrong path. That was not always the case. And I also think that part of building community trust is having closure to cases of homicide, yes.
So Ron,
And we're going to go to questions after that. But yeah.
So in the last 15 years of doing this work, and I would tell you, just for those who might not know, I grew up in the west side of Chicago, was part of the problem, engaged in the gangs. I served for 14 years in state prison. And it wasn't for purse snatching, but it was a violent offense. And I've been home, like I said, for almost 15 years. But this journey that I'm in, and the fact that I'm in the Department of Justice, has allowed me to bring that experience into a space like that to help inform colleagues and to learn from them as well. At the end of the day, when I think about my first year of doing this work, I attended 25 funerals, 25. And most of them are young men. So a lot of emphasis is put into youth, but the truth is the people who are driving the violence and are more likely to be shot are those that are between the ages of 18 and 24 or so. And that tends to be true in most cities. But that population gets overlooked. And so just to kind of go back to your question is that there is a big concern of why people are carrying guns. There are more guns today in Chicago every year. The number breaking of guns they remove out the streets. They're just not going to be able to do that. It's unsustainable. So what's not happening is that we're not addressing the real reason why people are carrying guns to begin with. And fundamentally, the reason why young people are carrying guns is because their own safety. They don't trust the systems that are in place right now to keep them safe. Fundamentally. So if I'm in their shoes, which I was at one point, it is the same common sense for me. And unless you live in those communities and put yourself in their shoes, like it's hard to understand the gratitude of individuals who carry these guns.
Let's go to a question. Anybody in the audience? Yes, on the side over here. Yeah. I think there's a mic coming. Hold on. There you go.
So I know that the FDA is trying to criminalize menthol cigarettes, and you know how the black, brown, people of color communities smoke menthol cigarettes at a higher rate than the general population. How are we going to deal with that kind of criminalization at the same time that we're also trying to decriminalize marijuana, right? To me, it seems just like another way to put black and brown people in jail for something that is legal right now. So can you please talk about the racial disparities about that FDA rule that's going to be coming out?
Well, I mean, I'll just say this. I do work for the feds, but
Yeah.
I can't speak on that because I'm not informed.
I'm not sure either. I'm not sure either of these. The question over here, maybe in the front. Hold on, Mike coming.
Yeah.
Hold on, Mike making its way.
Oh, she's pretty loud. I can hear her voice. She's got a good
Yeah,
voice.
but yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. You spoke about that most of the gun violence was between 18 and 24. There's been lots about depression for children, or 18 to 24. Do you think there's a connection with that?
I think there's a connection on a number of different things. We now have a study called the Aces that was produced, Rob Anda and a few other folks, maybe about 10 years ago or so. We have another study in Philadelphia that really focuses on urban violence, urban communities issues. We have Bruce Perry, right, who's also looked at brain development on the impact of trauma. My point here is, it took me to go to grad school to understand and to really process what I experienced as a young person. When you're experiencing a lot of trauma, a lot of violence, it does something to the brain. And we know that now today than we ever did before. And so a lot of times there's misdiagnosis, and they'll say that, well, this person has ADD or other learning disabilities. The truth is that trauma has shrinked actually your brain, and your frontal cortex hasn't really developed. Which is why some, Black and brown or whoever who are under constant stress are smoking or are thinking about maladaptive coping behaviors because of that. And so when you look at prison systems, for example, you look at people who are serving long sentences, they're individuals who caught the cases at a very young age. So there's always these connections that I draw back from this time of someone's development.
Linda, talk about that, because many of the people you're dealing with obviously have been exposed to trauma.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that, the pandemic just exacerbated that, because I think that for some, you realize that everybody didn't have a healthy home to go inside of and close the door and be locked in with your family. For some people it was fun and they were doing family games. That's not everybody's story. And so substance abuse rose, and people were outside more and people were desperate. And so I think that for a lot of reasons, the pandemic exacerbated exactly what Eddie is talking about, which made it that, it was definitely eye-opening for us to really, that's why we have to work with families. We can't just work with a person. We have to look at the entire family, because oftentimes the entire family is struggling. When you think there's not just one kid, the family is struggling. And also I think that, we have the People of Promise with over 200 people that we're focused on here in DC, and it's between 18 to 35 here in DC. But we also have community referrals that are young people that we know are on the edge of becoming victims or perpetrators, of gun violence, and that they are, that the community has identified them as being in need. And so they also are people that we are focusing on, because our credible messengers know them. They know who they are in the community. So they may not have made the list of People of Promise just yet because they don't have the long history, but we know that we need to grab them early. And so that's the conversation about the juveniles in this.
That, unfortunately, is all we have time for today. Will you join me in thanking Eddie and Linda? And thank you all for being here this morning. Thank you both.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage the Atlantic's Anna Bross.
Thanks again to our speakers and our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation, for supporting the Atlantic's journalism today. If you enjoyed these conversations and want more of The Atlantic, you can become a subscriber. Please visit theatlantic.com for more information on how to do that. And if you're already a subscriber, thank you. We have much more for you in store today, so please check out the Hop-In app for the complete agenda, a map to help you navigate our campus, and to sign up for additional sessions. And we'll see you at 2:30 at the Ideas stage at the Mead Center for American Theater. Enjoy the rest of your festival. Thank you so much.